Now for today's program. Susan Neiman is an American philosopher and writer and has written extensively on the Enlightenment, moral philosophy, metaphysics, and politics. An award-winning author of 9 books, translated into 15 languages, Susan's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and several German publications, among many others. Susan is a member of several institutes and societies, including the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences. In 2000, Susan assumed her current position as director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, Germany. Her latest book is Left is Not Woke. Joining Susan today is Robert Siegel. Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center on the JBS, Jewish Broadcasting Service Television Network. Robert is a special contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative and Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Susan Neiman and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you. And Susan, welcome. It's good to see you once again.
Glad to be here.
Your book is about a distinction between two terms that are often used in the U.S. As though they're synonymous, or at least as though they overlap largely in meaning. Woke and left. Your title is Left is Not Woke. You're writing from the left side. So let's start with some basic definitions. What do these two words mean to you? And what's so important about the distinction between them?
So I think the reason that we're all confused about this question is that, and I'm going to start with a second term, if I may. Woke is based on a confusion between emotions and thought. That is, woke appeals to very traditional left liberal emotions that we all share, namely the desire to stand on the side of people who are oppressed and to right historical wrongs, or at least to remember them. But it is undermined by some very reactionary philosophical assumptions that I don't think most people are aware of, and that's why I wrote this book. The word cancel culture appears only once in the first sentence, which says this is not about cancel culture. There've been enough about that. What I'm trying to do is to set out the ideas that I think the woke have lost and that are essential to any left liberal perspective. Now, there are 3 ideas that I think both the left and the liberal have in common and are crucial for all of us. And that's the idea that we're fundamentally universalist. We believe that you can have deep connections and deep commitments to people who don't belong to your tribe. That's always been a left liberal position. This is not to say we should all be the same or that cultural differences are unimportant. I think cultural differences are great. The more, the better. And I think it's really important, as much as one can, to immerse oneself. You can't possibly do it with every culture, but to take 1 or 2 cultures that are not part of your tribe, not part of your childhood experience, and to walk around in them for a while. It's both important for understanding ourselves and where we come from, and for understanding the common humanity that we find in other people. But when we think politically, we should think universally. And that's where the idea of universal human rights come from, which we just celebrated, or didn't. It was, I think, the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights on Sunday. The second important idea that the left and the liberal have in common is the idea that you try for justice, not simply for power. And this is an idea that, I mean, you see it in certain religious traditions, but it was particularly developed during the Enlightenment. And think about the fact that in the 18th century, simply having more power than the person next to you, guaranteed that the law was on your side. So the idea that we're equal before the law And of course, we're not. We know that we're not. I won't mention the American not quite election year. But although we're not in fact equal before the law, very, very often, the idea is to try for it.
We aspire to that equality before
exactly.
the law.
That's what we aspire to, not simply for more power for our tribe. And the third idea is that we believe that progress is possible, not necessary, but it's possible and it's actually happened in the past. Okay, so those are three ideas that I think the woke have lost that are common to people on the left and people who are liberals. There's a fourth idea that distinguishes the left from the liberal, and it's why I situate myself on the left. It's the idea that social rights are human rights. They're not benefits, they're not privileges, they're just as much rights as political rights are. And they're written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as aspirational, but they're there. So that's something that liberals and people on the left can disagree about at the moment, because I really am worried about the international rise of what I'm not afraid to call fascism in many, many countries. I'm looking for as big a tent or as much a united front as possible. And I, wrote this book partly in the hope that those of us who, as unfortunately left and liberals often do, have been squabbling about things, might unite around certain common ideas.
Well, that describes left, or left and liberal, as you would say. And you say there's something that the woke movement does not share here, and that you're writing about the philosophical underpinnings that even people who would proudly call themselves woke may not be aware of.
I'm not sure anybody calls themselves woke proudly anymore, because it really has become a term of abuse by the right. So much so that I had a number of friends who said, "Oh, please don't use the word woke in the title, Susan.
Okay.
You'll be instrumentalized by the right." I wasn't, at least not so far. Although I do think it's put a few people off reading it because they think it's going to be another kind of Bill Maher diatribe, but it's not. So what is so troubling about the woke is the focus on tribal identities as most important. And the funny thing is, I don't use the word identity politics because I think it presupposes what it already, what it's trying to convince us of, which is that the two most important features of our identity are ethnic background and sex. Now, think about it. I just think everybody should take 10 minutes and think about what components of their own identity are the most important to them. And it can change over time. And when my kids were younger, being a mother was at the forefront of my identity. It's still important, but they're grown up and it plays less of a role, obviously. But what one chooses to believe, what one's political positions, what kind of a profession one chooses, are all parts, crucial parts of our identity that we choose. And to boil all those down to the two things that we have no control over, say that's our identity, strikes me as really problematic. I'll just say this in a sentence in the hope of not talking any more about this question tonight. But I share some genes with Benjamin Netanyahu. But the fact that I'm a Jew is so much less important to me than the fact that I uphold the universalist tradition in Judaism, and that's a choice. I was also raised that way, raised with the idea that, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, you have a responsibility to look out for people who are strangers otherwise. Netanyahu takes the other tradition and talks about Amalek and the fact that you should be scared of every stranger because they're always out to get you. But the position that I have chosen is much more important to me
hmm
than any kind of genetic connection.
You,
And
you, you, yeah.
I know plenty of people of color who feel the same way. Yeah.
You write about the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer, assisted or at least not impeded by some other officers. It began, you say, as a mass movement, universalist in nature. It evolved into something more tribal than that, and you use the word ally. I think very, very meaningfully to describe what changed about it in terms of your relationship to it.
Well, in the beginning, and there were studies about this, over half of the people involved were described themselves as white. And remember, this is going out on the street in the middle of a pandemic for which there was as yet no vaccination or no cure. So people were putting something on the line, and they were doing it not, certainly in the case of people who were not Black, not because they felt their tribe was threatened, but because they thought it was a violation of human rights that unarmed Black people should be disproportionately killed by police for no good reason at all. That's a principled standing. That's not being an ally, okay?
Mhm.
Being an ally is, for a while you share common interests with somebody, like the US and the Soviet Union were allies during the Second World War. And when their interests diverged, they weren't allies anymore.
Yeah.
And I feel like the using the word, okay, you can be an ally, makes me feel, first of all, people only stand up for interests of some kind. I mean, it doesn't actually explain why 54% of people in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations were standing up. But it undermines the kind of principled solidarity that liberals and leftists are meant to uphold.
Yeah. Although this I must say took me back to a moment over 50 years ago. I'd been a member of my high school's chapter of Friends of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
Oh, bravo. Yeah.
We staged a few food drives to send food down south where people were being cut off from welfare because they were trying to register to vote and they were hard up against it. A couple of years later, a year later in college, some of the more politically engaged than I went to a big SNCC meeting where the whites, and our group was largely white, it was by far majority white. The whites were told, at least figuratively and possibly literally, to leave the movement.
Literally, they were literally told to leave. It's
Yeah,
funny that you mentioned that because I've just been expanding the book a little bit for the paperback edition, and I talk about that
yeah,
as a major, major split in the civil rights movement. I mean, Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schorner had just been murdered
yeah,
in the course of Freedom Summer, kind of childhood heroes of mine, and later Bob Moses is a huge hero of mine. I've written about him.
yeah,
I have been told that Stokely Carmichael, sort of close to his death, said that this was the biggest mistake he made.
yeah.
But it is a mistake that I think had repercussions and reverberated throughout the civil rights movement.
It was. I mean, I have to say, in the end, I think that a very universalist approach of the Southern Black Church turned out to, in a way, be more central to what happened in the South than SNCC. But at that moment of expelling the
Uh,
whites, what was at stake in the expulsion was an expression of pride, of saying this is our movement for our people. We've been, too many times we've been told from white people what we should be doing. It was defended by the likes of Carmichael.
It was no, he was the major person who pushed it through. You have to mention something.
Oh, Susan, you've frozen. Your image has frozen.
Over there at the time.
You're coming
So,
back. There you are. You froze for a second. So
so sorry. My internet connection is unstable. Can we wait for 1 second and let me try and switch connections just to make sure this doesn't happen?
Well, it's now good. I think it is. You're not speaking, so I don't know.
Robert, I think she'll probably have to reconnect. So
Okay.
just bear with us for a moment, folks.
Okay. If you bear with us, we are reconnecting.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you now, Susan. There you are.
It's hard to believe I live in the middle of Berlin, and my internet connection is not great.
Right.
Anyway, what happened, it wasn't yet called that, but it's now called We Don't Want Any White Saviors.
Mhm.
And, you know, I can understand the conflicts. I've read quite a bit about how that decision came to be. But, you know, a white person who sees herself as deeply committed to this struggle on grounds of general principle is not there by trying to be a savior or trying to have a complex.
Mhm.
One of the things that in that passage that you talk about, I quote Hannah Arendt as saying in her very controversial book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, Eichmann should have been indicted for crimes against humanity, not
Mhm.
crimes against the Jewish people. And it's a very important statement. I'm sure Arendt didn't realize quite, you know, how important that statement would become, but I'm still with her on that.
Yeah, it is a statement that would draw a very strong reaction from a great many Jews, saying you're trying to deny the specificity of the Nazi attitude towards the Jew, and that while there were other groups that were sent to the camps, you're belittling the crime of genocide by looking more at the broad array of victims of Hitler rather than what he did to the Jews.
Well, I mean, I can trace my answer to that once again back to the Bible. We have this experience of suffering, and the question is what we do with it.
Yeah.
Do we universalize it and say that's why we should take care of other people who are suffering? Or do we focus on the fact that they did it to us, they did it to us, they did it to us? I just got roasted, by the way, in the German press for arguing that it's important to take anti-Semitism and racism equally seriously. I actually think anti-Semitism is a form of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, there are historical differences between every form of racism. There are historical differences between the kinds of prejudices that people had towards Jews, that people have towards Blacks, that people have towards Asians. I mean, if historians want to argue about that, that's fine with me. But on a moral level, it seems to me extraordinarily important to talk about the common humanity of people who are persecuted solely in virtue of the fact that they belong to a particular tribe.
Yeah. No, I
Okay,
I would agree with
the
you.
point?
Yeah.
What's the point of remember? We're told to remember the Holocaust and never forget.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to never forget?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
Germans killed Jews in the 40s in horrible ways? No. We're supposed to draw a lesson from that, presumably.
And the number of American synagogues with signs about Darfur in front of them in recent years are an expression of that. And
why,
I would,
just one more point
yeah.
about that. Why did the Tree of Life synagogue, why was that the synagogue that was attacked? Because they were doing refugee work. And why was my synagogue in Atlanta, Georgia bombed? Because the rabbi was a close friend and you know, worker of Martin Luther King before King got the Nobel Prize or anything else. So.
No, the way that I understand what you're saying, and I think this is what you tell me if this is what you're saying. I believe that as an American Jew, my right to my identity and to worship as I choose and to express myself, those are rights that I believe I enjoy because I'm a human being and a citizen of the United States. The fact that I think I lost a great aunt in the Holocaust, one an aunt my father never knew because they were part of the family that never came over. That is irrelevant to my entitlement to fair treatment. It's an entirely different matter, and I don't think that I am due certain freedoms because I have a connection to catastrophe. Anyway,
Indeed, I share that.
good.
Or, I mean, I would go on to say, many Jews believe that precisely because we have a connection that we say every year at Pesach to our
Yes.
own catastrophe, it's up to us to try to prevent others and at least to stand on the side of other people who are oppressed and
Yes.
discriminated against.
I'm glad you raised Passover at this moment. Many of us encounter a woke worldview, even if it's, as you say, it's not called that anymore, through new uses of the language. The most alarming, if hilarious, example of this that I've experienced was a very sweet teenage girl with her mother approached my wife and me was we were walking our dog and asked, looking at the dog, "May I pet them?" And she was, I believe, denying our dog the microaggression of belittling the gender fluidity that was available to her. Newsrooms across America have argued over whether it's all right to say pregnant women in stories about abortion, or should it change to pregnant persons?
Germany too. This is not
Yeah,
only an American issue.
a woke Passover Seder would, I assume, begin with the line, "We were enslaved persons unto Pharaoh in Egypt. God forbid we should acknowledge the fact that we were slaves." You write at one point, sometimes language should hurt as much as the circumstances it denotes.
Yeah. And I find, it's as if we feel like we have to put like a cushion around language describing difficult things. We and that's actually false. I mean, the case of slavery,
Mhm.
We know the slaves were persons, but the slaveholders didn't treat them as persons.
Mhm.
And it seems to me much more realistic to say they were slaves, we were slaves in Egypt. Again, people talking about unhoused people as if that would make being homeless
Yes.
somehow less painful. It's not. Instead, I feel like it takes away the harshness of the actual condition.
You're describing a conflict between universalism and a kind of tribalism that has developed, and the virtues of universalism and the pursuit of universal values is rooted in, as you write, Enlightenment thinking of the 18th century. When you're writing at your most philosophical in this book, you're describing how the Enlightenment has come under broad and it seems fairly successful attack. And the people who inspired Jefferson to express sentiments that were far more principled than Jefferson himself was capable of living up to, people who lifted the golden rule out of a religious context and enunciated this as a principle of how we live how we live in society. Uh, do I get that now in a university context that these people are all just a bunch of old white European dead men who were seen as having trying to fob off their European worldview and ideas on a world that they were busily enslaving and conquering?
Well, that's the claim of the woke and or the post-colonial thinkers. Those are two kind of loose categories that probably no one would actually acknowledge, but they're very real things. And the
Mhm.
one thing that holds them together is exactly that idea. And it's, you can say that those discussions take place in universities, but I mean, journalists go to universities.
Yes, yes.
And it's stuff that has seeped into the water stream of an awful lot of mainstream discussion, press, universities, publishing companies. It's not just something that 20-somethings are doing on college campuses, not in the least. you hear very often, well, the Enlightenment was the age of reason and human rights, but it was also the age of slavery and colonialism. I say, guys, you're confusing cause with correlation.
Mhm.
The Enlightenment thinkers were left-wing intellectuals. We don't always win our battles by any means. It would be
Mhm.
like, holding you responsible for the war in Iraq, which I don't know what you were doing during the war in Iraq, but there were millions of people all over the world protesting it, and
Well, I was broadcasting about it, but yes,
yeah,
just to
okay.
correct.
So but it would say, well, Robert Siegel lived during the war in Iraq,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. No, 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 no.
he wasn't able to stop it, even though he, talked about it and did this and that. So, it's a silly way of looking at history and looking at intellectual history. And it's actually occurred to me that if the Enlightenment thinkers were still alive, they could sue for defamation, because they were actually the people who first coined the idea of Eurocentrism, who
Yes,
first said, we need to look at the world not just from European perspectives. We need to also look at the way the world might criticize Europe. And they did. All of them did that. And they did it, some of them under, threat of death or exile.
yes, yes.
Okay.
Well,
So yeah, and they all
and
criticized slavery. They all criticized colonialism. I once wanted as an exercise, but I couldn't figure out how to do it, to put passages of Diderot next to passages of Frantz Fanon and
mhm,
see if the reader would guess who was who. But since Diderot talks about poison arrows, it sort of gave away the
yeah.
game.
How does the left woke distinction figure as you see it in the two big wars that are underway right now, in Ukraine and in Gaza? Both feature appeals to universal principles, that people shouldn't be killing civilians or they should be respecting national boundaries. Both have very strong tribal aspects, with people defending or even celebrating violence that they would hate to see visited upon themselves. How do you see those two conflicts?
Oh, I think it's a mistake to conflate those two conflicts. I think they're very, very different. But I've got to confess, since I have spent something like 16 hours every day following the other war, I have not been reading what the American media is saying about Ukraine and Russia. There was an excellent piece by Fintan O'Toole in the New
Mhm.
York Review arguing that it's a terrible mistake to conflate those conflicts. So look, but it is definitely messing up the international discussion over Israel-Palestine. It's quite interesting to me that all my grown children, we disagree about lots of things, but without talking to each other, we all had exactly the same take on Israel-Palestine. That is, being horrified at the Hamas massacre, um, and also being horrified at the bombing of Gaza and wanting for there to be a ceasefire yesterday. And that one can't hold those two truths in one's head
Mhm.
is a sign of where the international discussion has gone. It's interesting, my kids, who I would describe as more woke than I am, that's
Mhm.
one of the things that we would disagree on. They lost friends because people in their circles expected them to look at Hamas's attack as a liberation of Palestine. And none of my kids were prepared to do that because they're also all Israeli citizens and they have a certain, but it's not just that they have a tribal commitment to the country. They lived in the country when they were young for 5 years. But I guess they also share my general view of human rights. Human rights are being violated on both sides, and that shouldn't be so hard to say. Once again, looking back to the Iraq War, it was not so hard to be horrified by 9/11 and at the same time to be deeply opposed to the war on Iraq.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't see why we can't make that parallel now.
I want you to to be a philosophy professor for us right now for a moment about a particular writer. Give us a little introduction. I keep coming across his name in contemporary political writing, usually about the rise of autocracy. But you spoke of his fascism and in the many flavors of undemocratic authoritarian rule that are emerging around the world. People refer to the writing of Carl Schmitt, and I've never read Carl Schmitt, although I've read about something about of what he stood for. You write about him as a key figure in undermining confidence in the Enlightenment and undermining the principles of the Enlightenment. So tell us, a Nazi jurist.
He was a Nazi jurist who was actually briefly jailed after the war and who lived a very long time afterwards and never regretted it. And in fact, specifically said things like, you know, what the Allies are doing is terrorism. Denazification is terrorism. Okay. Honestly, I have spent some time with Carl Schmitt, and
you mean reading Carl Schmitt?
Oh God, no, I never met him.
Yeah.
But I knew people who did, who respected him. There are a lot of people who think he was a very significant thinker of the 20th century. And actually, I first read him in a seminar reading group at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. So he's got or at least had for quite a time, a role in intellectual history. Once again, even for people who don't read him, you know, their professors read him, and they got this basic view that the only real political distinction is between friend and enemy, and that's how the world is. It's both a childish and a very reactionary, I mean, super tribalistic view. It's very clear about that. And the only explanation that I really can have for the fact that he acquired quite a large following on the left in the 90s and the aughts is that he's very critical of the hypocrisies of liberal democracies.
Yeah.
So he calls the British Empire a monumental act of piracy. He attacks the Monroe Doctrine for the same reason, but he's saying this in 1942. Germany is at war, you know, with Britain and Americans. So it's not like he's fighting on behalf of anti-colonialist struggles.
Yeah.
He's saying if they did this, we can do it too, all the way to Vladivostok, you know. So honestly, I'm at a loss. I've tried hard to understand why people have been so captivated by him.
Yes.
But it's a real problem.
He, as I understand it, I mean, he elevated the notion of politics to simply being a matter of your friend is your friend, your enemy is your enemy, and whatever rules and laws we have are there for the leader. We have a leader who is empowered to violate all of those laws. I mean, this was somebody, as I say, writing during the Nazi era. It wasn't a hypothetical idea that he was describing.
I think when he fits where he appeals to people more directly is in undermining the idea that there's a difference between justice and power, because he thinks that's impossible.
Right.
He thinks justice is hype. You know, and again, he points to these violations of justice by the British or the Americans, and he's right to point them out. But his conclusion is there is no such thing as justice.
Yes.
That's all hype. All politics is about is different tribes getting power. And there's a very famous quote, whoever uses the word humanity wants to deceive you. So.
Which is, as I believe you write, is in a way, it's a citation of a 19th century writer who said that humanity is some kind of Jewish fiction that's been foisted upon the world to try to take over.
Oh, he actually thinks it's a Jewish fiction.
He thinks it's a Jewish fiction.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, you know,
or a modern fiction.
I think what may be the appeal of this is, as you say, that I'm reminded of being a college student in the only philosophy course I took, and I was a bit, I did find the optimism of John Locke, I guess, to be a little bit rosier than I had seen life being. And I asked the professor, and because the professor was making the point that Marx drew upon this very optimistic view of human nature in his view. And I said, well, who would be a thinker who took a really pessimistic view, who thought that we should be really worried about people conquering us and pillaging our towns? And he mentioned Hobbes, and Thomas Hobbes, who said that without laws, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Description of one boss I once had. And I think to some people the reality isn't hopeful. Now you make great cases about why we should be hopeful, why we can see progress in human behavior, but that's not altogether evident to everyone.
So you're asking a whole lot of questions, and I'm not going to
Yes,
ask
I'm sorry.
who your philosophy professor was, because it's a caricature of the Enlightenment. And first of all, Locke, I agree with you about Locke. Locke is really pre-Enlightenment. He's writing before the great age of Enlightenment, okay? But you don't have to read Kant or Rousseau, although you probably should read Rousseau. He's marvelous. But just reread Candide, okay? Voltaire,
yes. No,
Candide, who is absolutely central to the Enlightenment and is attacking this loony optimistic view of that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. This is not an Enlightenment view. It's a view the Enlightenment attacked. I wrote an entire book called Evil in Modern Thought, which is available in paperback and keeps coming out in different languages and editions and stuff. And it doesn't just talk about the Enlightenment, but I focus on the Enlightenment. They were obsessed with the problem of evil. They were not sunny people at all. They were very much aware of the evils of their age. They wrote about them, but they thought, unlike people, namely the Catholic Church in particular, who had this doctrine of original sin, which everything was unless you were saved, they thought it was possible, just possible, for human beings to make progress. They did not think it was inevitable. That, Hegel sort of did, but that's the next century. They thought it was possible. And, that's the only view, it seems to me, that we can take without throwing up our hands and letting the world really go to hell in a handbasket. I completely agree with you that things look terrifying. Bernie Sanders, who's older than I am, said this is the most terrifying time of his life. I mean, they're just, we don't have to list them. Everybody can read them every day in the paper. But hope is not an emotion. It's, at least as Kant saw it, and Noam Chomsky, and both of them I follow, it's a moral obligation. Because if all of us who might conceivably contribute to saving the planet from the twin dangers of a climate crisis and a rise in proto-fascism, if all of us throw up our hands and go out and get stoned or, whatever it is, well, it will really go to hell.
Right.
Okay. So I'm not being hopeful because I have a rosy picture of what the world looks like right now. I don't.
Well, I've read you on this point before, but you make a very good case that the fact that we do not go to witness the public torture of criminals as a form of entertainment, family entertainment, is something that suggests a certain positive moral progress force inside us that makes us, in some ways, even as terrible things continue, more civilized than our ancestors might have been 200 years ago.
Well, that's one thing. My other favorite example, which you will probably remember, maybe you'll be the counterexample. So during the Vietnam War, as we know,
yes, I know what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
during the Vietnam War, all you had to do to get a 4F deferment was to walk into your draft board for 15 minutes and do some caricature of a gay gesture and say, you were looking forward to serving with all those good-looking cadets, and you'd be out in 15 minutes, okay? Because it wasn't until Obama that gays and lesbians could openly serve in the military. I knew a lot of people, everybody knew that. I mean, there was an Arlie Guthrie or Country Joe and the Fish song about it. I mean, everybody knew that. And people would sit around at night talking about how am I going to get out of the draft? And I don't know a single person who ever did that because they were so afraid that the stigma would follow them, that they weren't just pretending it. They really were at heart gay.
Mhm.
Um, that they would rather go to Canada or England or sometimes to prison
Right.
and that little trick. And that's how much we've changed in a
Right.
generation,
Well,
right? That my daughter can say, oh yeah, his husband is coming over, whatever.
right, and we take that as normal now. Well, so this raises for me, I'm free associating into another question that I want to put to you before we get to questions uh, from the audience, which is that uh, politics, as I first saw it growing up in New York City, was a peculiar kind of tribalism. If there were three positions in the city government that you voted for, the mayor, the city council president, the comptroller, you wanted to have a balanced ticket of an Irishman, an Italian, and a Jew in some ways. And they were wonderful. One of my favorite tickets lost was a Lefkowitz, Fino, and Gilhooly. Just for the name, I thought it was a classic. That would be Beam, O'Connor, Procaccino. I mean, uh, Nelson Rockefeller would have a sound truck driving through the neighborhood where I lived with the slogans in Spanish, Rocky para gobernador. And politics was organized largely around ethnicity and religion, and it entailed not just uh, a sense of pride that your guy had some citywide position, but as my father described it to me in the 1920s, it determined uh, who got the next high school principalship, which rotated on a religious basis. All kinds of jobs, patronage jobs, were determined in this way, and tribalism figured in those choices. Politics really there were some ideas in there, and there was a certain reverence for Mrs. Roosevelt, or the memory of the New Deal that still animated the only big party that would win elections in the city at least. But politics was about getting stuff.
Well,
And
I can recommend. There's also a new book. I think it came out a little bit before mine by the British philosopher, South Asian origin, Kenan Malik, who also
uh-huh.
writes for The Guardian. He wrote a book called Not So Black and White, and we agree on a lot of points. It's a different kind of book than mine is. But I actually quoted him now saying, what's going on among the woke, it takes us back to Tammany Hall.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yes, yes. And uh, without any deep philosophical acknowledgement of what the roots of Tammany Hall were in the process.
That's right. That's right.
So is there hope for universalism given the trends you write about?
There's not hope for anything else. That's all I can say. It's looking grimmer than it looked 2 months ago. It's really interesting to see people splitting, friendships shattering over, since October 7th. But there isn't any hope for anything else because, look, point number one, the only solution for the climate crisis has to be international, and not just my interests versus your interests and my country versus your country. That's the only way we're going to solve this. And my tiny bit of hope is that people are going to realize that, and that will be the moment. But secondly, we have these rising, I have an Indian friend who says if we wait to use the word fascism till they build concentration camps, it will be too late to stop them. So I certainly think that one can talk about rising Indian fascism, Chinese fascism, just the Chinese woman last night who says she grew up with the view that one couldn't do anything. So she just doesn't do politics. She plays music.
Yeah.
And she doesn't even follow the news, okay?
Yeah.
And of course, there have been plenty of uses of the word lately in the American media, thanks to Trump's latest descriptions of what he would do in a second term. So, all of that are war cries for my tribe versus your tribe. People like Xi and Modi specifically say, don't talk to us about human rights. Those are Western concepts. You colonized us, go away. I mean, really, that's
Yeah.
what they're doing.
Yeah.
And of course, Trump is in the same basket. So there is no hope without universalism. Whether we'll manage to turn the tide, I would say, depends on all of us.
Well, Susan, thanks a lot. It's always good to talk with you and to listen to you. And I want to hand us over to
And here, by
Suzanne.
the way, you did a great interview for my last book, so I was very happy that you asked again.
Okay. I was happy to. I'm going to hand off to Suzanne Borden, who has some questions, I guess, from our listeners.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you, for that great conversation. Let's see if we can get to some of these questions. When, and this is particularly for the United States, when did the term woke really take hold and become an enemy of the right? And why do so many young people, particularly on college campuses, embrace it?
So again, I don't know anybody who is embracing the word now, but it played no role in the 2016 American election, which is really interesting. It did not come up, although a very smart young woman that summer said, Trump's going to win because of political correctness, because people are sick of political correctness, which I thought was very insightful. She's now a star Princeton student. She was only in high school at the time. Look, there are a lot of features, including, I think, bad theories. You talked about Schmidt, Robert. We didn't talk about Foucault. That's another
Right.
but he is the most cited scholar in both the humanities and the social sciences on anything right now, and certainly in post-colonial theory. That's the classic work that everybody who does anything in the humanities today reads, who goes to college. It's Foucault. And he's actually much closer to Schmidt than it looks like on the surface. And I talk about that in the book. But I also think there was something else that happened after 2016. For those of us who were privileged to experience Obama's first election in 2008, the world really did change. And by the way, it was an international experience, going about that. But for somebody who grew up during the Obama era, it was just kind of normal to have this Black family in the White House who were all smart and cool and had integrity and did not make a single major mistake. You might have disagreed with, if you were old enough to have policy disagreements with Obama, but as our first family, that was the norm. That wasn't anything special. And the arc of history really was bending towards justice. And then along comes the exact opposite. And I mean, not only the president, but the presidential family. And I think for people who grew up in the Obama era, that must have been such an awful shock, okay? That there was the feeling that you really can't do much, except you can try to fight racism here or there. You can change language. You can't really change anything significant.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions. One was, how did the idea of helping the underdog turn against the Jewish people who were always champions of the underdog? And how can those of us who are traditionally liberal push back against woke ideology without being called racist?
Well, I hate to cite myself, but on the first question, you can look up, and it's on my website, a piece that I wrote for the New Statesman a week or two ago. They asked a bunch of people what it means to be a left-wing Jew. Um, uh, you know, look, I grew up being told that Jews are always on the side of the underdog. That was the case for a long time. It wasn't thereafter, okay? And we just have to we have to face the facts. And I think both sides were at fault. There was this wonderful solidarity, which is still, if you go down south and you talk even to a woke Black college student, she'll say, Jews are okay, Jews are different. You're not really white people. You don't hear that in the North, okay? But I think Stokely Carmichael's kicking out the Jews in SNCC was a major problem. But let's also face it, that as Jews got more assimilated, plenty of people were not willing to side with the underdog. Okay, so there's a split between the Jewish people that I was very surprised to find out existed, because I grew up in this one universalist tradition, but it's there, and I think we should acknowledge it. And it's only a few pages, a piece that I just wrote for the Statesman. It might interest you. The question about pushing back on woke, sorry, this isn't meant to be a sales pitch, but I wrote a whole book on how to do that, despite the fact that, again, my friends were warning me, you're going to be instrumentalized, you're going to be instrumentalized. And I said, I don't think so. If I put the word socialist on the first page, is the right really going to take me up? And in fact, they didn't. There was one right-wing podcast that said, well, she has a few good ideas, but you have to go through a lot of left-wing bullshit to get there. So, and there were certain shows that I didn't appear on that I definitely would have sold more books, but my publisher wanted to put me on certain things. And I said, no, I'm not. Well, we know you don't want Fox. And I said, no, I don't even want Bill Maher. That's the kind of, what shall I say? It's just contemptuous bashing that bothers me a lot. It's sneering rather than doing any kind of serious analysis about where the woke, who I generally think are really moved by good intentions. I really think most of the people who I would call woke want justice. They want progress, and they don't realize how the ideas that they have are undermining them. So again, I wrote a short book that, I hope some people might take as a handbook for, this is how you make your arguments. The paperback edition, which is coming out in the spring, is going to be clearer and better and just slightly longer, but not very long. So you might want to wait for that.
How do you
lighter and lighter.
how do you convince those who you want to read that to actually that it's worth their time? Because they don't think they're wrong. They don't think that they're pushing things to the right.
I give a lot of talks, and it turns out that when I do, people realize that I'm actually talking sense, and that I'm also saying things that everybody's been saying to their good friends in private and haven't been saying in public. And that includes people in their 20s as well as people in their 60s, okay? People who've been having these conversations and, gosh, I always thought I was left, but, what are they doing now? And this is really troubling. And at one point when I was having one of these conversations with a friend of mine, I said, who said, I guess I'm not left anymore if this is left. I said, no, you have always been left. They're not left right now. And then I went to try and figure out exactly why that's the case. And cancel culture is just a means that is used both by the right and the left. That's a method. I don't think it's a good thing. But it doesn't go deep enough into understanding why we're so confused about this problem.
That actually leads into the next question, which we can get to before we wrap up. Somebody mentioned, like you said, your children mentioned, losing a lot of friends that they thought that they were aligned with values-wise. They live in a progressive neighborhood, and they're shocked that they're not they're not embraced as part of their community. And then I also have somebody else saying, what advice do you have for parents of college students who consider themselves woke, coming home for the holidays, how to relate to them, talk to them. So what advice do you have for these two types of people that I imagine a lot of people are feeling?
Again, I know people who are buying the book as Christmas presents for their kids, but look, I think the first thing to acknowledge is your heart is in the right place. I understand why your heart, why you care about the people who are being maximally oppressed right now. And I'm with you on that. But it is possible to hold two truths in your head at the same time. There are different forms of evil. And that's very clear to me right now. It just seems that one can both condemn Hamas and condemn, as people do in Haaretz every day. There's an English edition, if you don't know, the leading Israeli newspaper. It is full of condemnation of the government, of the war, of the way in which the government was in many ways responsible for the war. That was also published in the New York Times a few days ago. You can be a Jew and, precisely because you do care about Jews and you do care about Israel, say this government is driving Israel to ruin, and it's hurting Jews in the diaspora. And let's face it, it's not just the occupation. Netanyahu's governments have been on the wrong side of every political conflict. I'll tell you what really got to me. I know we got to quit in a second, but Vladimir Zelensky is not only the first Jewish president of Ukraine, he's the first Jewish president of a Slavic country. And my people come from Eastern Europe, and I have the kind of worries about the Slavs in my bones, right? And this was something to celebrate about Ukraine, that the Israeli government would not give him the Iron Dome, which is a defensive weapon, share the technology, when Kyiv was being bombed to pieces because Netanyahu didn't want to get on the bad side of the Russians. I just felt, wait, how can you be a nationalist, talk about the Jewish people, but I mean, in any case, whether or not Zelensky were Jewish or not, it was a clear war of aggression that was unprovoked and needed to be resisted. But it's that kind of really, I think, very cynical being on the wrong side of a lot of conflicts that has made many people fear for Israel's soul, not just for its safety, but for its soul.
Thank you. And as you said, we are running a minute over, but can we just go back 1 second? A few people just asked if you could clarify the terms universalism and actually the term woke, so that people can kind of walk away understanding what woke means.
Universalism means that the things that hold us together are the things that are politically the most important. Culturally, we can have all the differences we like. For the woke, it's tribal identities. That's why you have the whole question of cultural appropriation coming up. It's tribal identities that are most central. And that feeds into the next question, next of my principles that I lay out. The woke, although they don't always say this, but a lot of what comes out implies that there isn't any real conception of justice. Justice has been violated so many times and used as hype to justify, say, the war in Iraq. Oh, we just want to bring them democracy. That let's forget about claims to justice. Let's go back to Tammany Hall, as Robert was pointing out, and let me fight for the interests of my tribe, okay? And there's a big difference between that. You know, I don't know how much time we have. I mean, this is I was trying to answer that question at the beginning, but obviously it didn't work. I mean, one interesting point is the question of intersectionality, which you might think was a universalist move, but it's not, because it's focusing on the different ways in which different tribes, or people who may be part of the same tribe, are victims, and not what they do in the world. I mean, it's a big part, and I talk about this in the book, is placing our identity in our most victimized self. And I kind of hoped when I first heard the term intersectionality, oh, hey, maybe this is, working towards some kind of universalist position, but it's not.
Okay. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Robert, Susan, thank you so much for your time today. I want to thank the audience for joining us. I want to remind everybody that Susan's book is Left is Not Woke. I will be sending out a follow-up email, and we'll include a link to the book in that email. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you next time.